Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the research seminar series of the School of Political Science and International Studies at UQ. We are absolutely delighted to announce that our speaker of this afternoon is Dr. Elizabeth Thurbon of UNSW. She's internationally and, of course, nationally recognized for her research on international political economy, of techno-industrial development and change, with a particular focus on East Asia and Australia. Her most significant contributions to the field examine the rise and transformation of Northeast Asia's developmental states and the relationship between international trade and financial integration, and the pursuit of transformative economic and social goals in Australia and the region. She has written widely on these subjects for academic and also popular audiences. Her most recent book, The Developmental Mindset, Revival of Financial Activism in South Korea. I think it's out already, Liz?
It is.
With Cornell University, so congratulations.
Thank you.
And I would just like to say that she's also the co-author of two popular books on Australian political economy, one entitled National Insecurity, which was out in 2007, and the other, which has a great title, How to Kill a Country. And the latter was shortlisted for the Queensland Premier's Literary Award for Advancing Public Debate. So great to, great to have you with us, Liz. And today, Liz will be speaking on explaining, or the title of her presentation is Explaining the Striking Revival of Financial Activism in South Korea since 1997, towards an agent-centered understanding of developmental states and their evolution. Over to you.
Thanks so much, Heloise, and thank you so much for having me. It's a real delight to be here with so many lovely familiar faces and to make some new connections as well. So I'm really delighted to be sharing today the outcomes of a project that I have been working on for many years in a lot of different ways, and that's concluded, as Heloise mentioned, recently in the shape of a book, thank heavens, that appeared in April, called Developmental Mindset, the Revival of Financial Activism in South Korea. As some of you would know, I've been working on developmental states and on South Korea for quite a long time now, but I was motivated to write this particular book by an experience I had in 2012 in Korea, where I was fortunate enough to spend some time as a Korea Foundation Fellow at Seoul National University. And I was there to study the status of Korea's developmental state in light of very widespread claims of developmental state demise in East Asia generally and in South Korea in particular. And quite early on in my visit, I was speaking with one of the pioneers of Korea's robotic industry development initiatives, Professor Oh Sang-rok. And he was telling me about some of the discussions that he'd had as a government official with chaebol representatives. The chaebol are the very big conglomerates in South Korea, like Samsung. And he was relating to me the different ways that he, as a policymaker, had been trying to convince the chaebol managers to throw their energies into frontier technology investments. And he was lamenting to me the fact that while the chaebol had become really amazing fast followers, they now needed to make this transition to becoming technological leaders and market pioneers, but they seemed really reluctant to do it. And so the government wanted to change their attitude. So Professor O was talking me through some of the ways that the government had tried to make that come about, and I'll talk more about those strategies later. But a part of it involved leaning on local banks to extend favourable finance to local firms in particular industries like robotics. But it struck me when I was talking to him how different this mindset was from the mindset of, say, Australian industry policymakers. And specifically, I was really struck by his obvious concern with and dedication to the task of trying to predict future growth areas, trying to shape the long-term investment strategies of particular firms, and how natural it seemed to him that the government could and should play that kind of role, that the government could and should identify which industries were going to be successful in the future and which technology should be targeted for promotion, that the government should actively try and create new markets for those technologies and products, even where the private sector was very reluctant, that it could and should try and direct favourably termed finance to local firms, in particular industries. And this mindset wasn't unique to Professor O. It was apparent in almost all of my subsequent interviews. I spoke with about 35 senior officials during that visit engaged in designing and implementing high-tech industry development strategies in 2012, but the book itself draws on interviews with around 100 senior industrial and financial policymakers over a 13-year period, including many presidential economic secretaries, ministers and vice ministers. So what surprised me exactly then about seeing this mindset in action? I wasn't surprised that it existed per se in Korea. I'm familiar with Korea. I know that the government has historically taken a really proactive role in developing national technological autonomy, in building local manufacturing capacity in strategic industries, and fostering the export orientation of local firms. But what surprised me, I think, was finding evidence of that mindset in 2012. Because for the previous 8 years, the very dominant message in the English language literature had been that the Korean developmental state was done and dusted, and that strategic industrial governance was a thing of the past, and that Korea had somehow now converged on a regulatory or a neoliberal or an Anglo-American kind of model of capitalism. And I was really surprised because what I was hearing just did not match. It was totally contradicted that popular picture of developmental state decline. And I know that there are two Koreas, but I was pretty sure that I was looking at the same Korea as these other people were describing. We were seeing two very different things, reaching very different conclusions. So I thought, well, it's probably time to look at the literature on developmental state decline to see what exactly lay behind their arguments, and why they weren't seeing what I was seeing. And this is what the first chapter of the book does. It takes a really careful look at what I call the declinist literature that focuses on Korea in particular and subjects it to critical scrutiny. And in doing that, I end up advancing a conceptual defence of the developmental state idea more broadly, along with a new analytical framework for studying developmental state emergence and evolution. And then in the remainder of the book, I then apply that framework to explain a really striking, but again, ignored empirical phenomenon, which is the revival of financial activism in South Korea since the 1997 financial crisis. By financial activism, I mean government efforts to strengthen the link between the financial and the productive sectors of the economy, to direct favourably termed finance to local firms in strategic industries, often on a performance-linked basis. So to get the money, firms have to achieve technological upgrading targets or export targets. And why do I describe the revival of financial activism in Korea as striking? Well, the first is because of its extent. Here's where my lovely PowerPoint graphs came in, but you'll just have to take my word for it that I have a number of graphs that show lending by development banks, by policy finance institutions, since 1997 has gone up exponentially, and in particular since 2008. So now, despite more than a decade of quite dedicated financial liberalisation, the Korean government still effectively sits at the centre of the nation's financial system. Development bank lending accounts for a quarter of all lending in the Korean economy. And in fact, it's gone up from 25% in 2012 to 30% today. Just got back from Korea last week and discovered that this revival continues apace. And so Korea really stands out from most developed countries in this regard, with the exception of Germany, whose development banks are around the same contribute around the same amount. But in Japan, which has historically been known as a developmental state, development bank lending has gone down from around 22% to around 11 or 10% now. So Korea is striking among even historic developmental states. And this can't simply be dismissed. The role of these banks can't simply be dismissed as, bailing out firms in times of crisis, because so much of their new lending goes to firms in new industries, and in particular new and renewable energy industries, green industries, in robotics industries, in other frontier technologies. And it's also not just bailing out firms in trouble, because it's made on a conditional basis, that is technological upgrading, export targets. And obviously I think this revival is really striking too, because again, as I've said, it just contradicts the conventional account that since 1997 Korea has liberalised and normalised. So the conceptual and analytical framework that I develop in the book is aimed at explaining both the revival of financial activism and developmental state evolution more broadly. So in the rest of the talk, I'd like to just address 5 quick points. The first thing I want to do is say a little bit about why I grapple with declinist debates as I do in the book by limiting my attention to declinist debates about Korea, not to Japan, for example. Second, I'll address what I call the radical declinist literature and what I see as the main flaws in their approach, particularly their methodological problems. And that will bring me to my third point, to my own approach to the study of developmental states and their evolution, and an overview of the conceptual and analytical framework that I am advancing. Then I'll quickly return to the declinist literature and the limitations of the more moderate declinist approach, because that approach actually does take the ideational aspects of developmentalism, what I call the mindset aspects, seriously, as I do. And then I'll conclude by sketching out my argument about the revival of financial activism and highlighting some broader implications of the study. Sounds like a lot. Promise I won't take more than half an hour now. So first, why do I grapple with declinist debates as I do in the book by focusing on Korea and not Japan, which is of course the archetypal, the first developmental state, and people have been predicting the decline of Japan's developmental state since the 1980s, so it would be logical, arguably, to look at Japan. Well, I don't do that, and I focus on Korea for 2 main reasons. First, because declinists have generally taken Korea as their case study of choice since 1997. Korea, unlike Japan, has adopted a lot of financial liberalisation reforms, and it's for this reason that declinists are saying, well, Korea has definitely dismantled. So it's the test case for the declinists. And the second reason that I focus on Korea is because of its status as a developmental state emulator, not a pioneer. So I mentioned before that scholars for a really long time have been predicting the decline of Japan's developmental state or its development model. And there are some really striking similarities in the arguments that since the 80s have been made about Japan that are now being made about Korea. And quite a sophisticated debate now does exist about the direction of state transformation in Japan that refutes the idea of Japan's neoliberal or regulatory makeover. But when it comes to assessing the question of developmental state transformation and the analytical utility of the developmental state concept more generally, I think Japan's a really bad place to start, not a helpful place to start. Because while that literature is quite sophisticated, it's very much grounded in or framed against the varieties of capitalism literature, not the developmental state literature. In other words, it really focuses on the question of the durability or otherwise of the unique Japanese model, rather than a generalisable developmental state model. And the difference there is subtle, but it's really important. So if you think about Stephen Vogel's impressive study on the recent direction of Japanese reform, he focuses on the durability of institutional features that are quite unique to Japan, like lifetime employment and tight inter-firm relations and the main bank system, not on factors that are said to unite developmental states or to form part of a wider developmental state model. So that literature on Japan holds important theoretical insights, I'm sure, into the question of state transformation, but it's not a sufficient basis from which to critique broader propositions about developmental state demise. And here the benefit of a focus on Korea becomes really clear, because Korea is widely acknowledged as an emulator of Japan's developmental state model, whatever that means. So if we focus on Korea, that really facilitates a much more targeted discussion of what actually constitutes a developmental state and the ongoing relevance of that concept. So, having explained the benefits of a Korea focus, let's now have a look at the propositions of the radical declinists. They are very much united in their view that the era of the developmental state is already over, that neoliberal transformation is essentially complete. For the radical declinists, liberalisation measures adopted since the 1990s have undermined what was once the state's key policy instrument, and that is control over finance. So reforms like the creation of an independent central bank, the widespread entry of foreign financial institutions, and the introduction of tougher lending standards make it really impossible for Korea now, the argument goes, to pursue its debt-based national champion strategy that so defined its industrialisation drive. And if you then add to those constraints tough new international trade obligations that rule out other forms of industry promotion, then obviously the Korean developmental state must be hamstrung. So in light of that, the radical declinists say the state now has to limit its role itself to a regulatory rather than a developmental role. And that just basically involves establishing the monitoring the rules of free market competition, not trying to strategically guide the economy. So that's the most popular view, I think, of currently of state the status of Korea's developmental state. And I should point out that I agree 100% that the regulatory changes that Korea has implemented since 1997 have been far-reaching and really significant. But in my view, these radical claims of developmental state decline and neoliberal transformation misread the direction of change in Korea, and they misread it because their analyses are both methodologically and conceptually flawed. So methodologically, radicals make a mistake of confusing the developmental state model with a particular empirical case. That is, they mistake Korea's 1970s top-down authoritarian state and its very heavy-handed approach to industrial development as the developmental state model. Put another way, they define developmentalism in terms of very static policies and unchanging policies that involve promoting national champions via heavy-handed financial sector control. And then any change from that specific policy approach is explained or depicted as developmental state dismantling. But there's obviously, for me, I think, a real problem with defining developmental states in terms of a fixed set of policy instruments, because it overlooks the fact that in Northeast Asia's developmental state, policy variation has been the norm from the get-go, and not just between countries, but within countries over long periods of time. They've changed their policies from the 60s through to the 70s through to the 80s. Policy variation has been the norm. So for that reason, defining Korea's developmental state in terms of a fixed set of policy instruments and then generalising a model from that highly specific case is really problematic. It overlooks the fact that policy variation and evolution has been the norm in Korea from the get-go. And that idea that evolution has been the norm is pointed out by lots of scholars, actually, in the literature that says Korea's developmental state still exists. Linda Weiss, Alice Amsden, Wan Wen-chu, Sadia Pekkanen, Steve Vogel, more recently Sun Young Kim, and myself. And these scholars have all said, well, looking at various industries, East Asia's states, as the conditions have changed, have sought to devise new policies to meet those new challenges. They haven't always been successful, because it's quite important to point out, but they serve to highlight the problems inherent in conceptualising developmentalism in very static policy terms. So what do radical declinists make of these kinds of arguments? Well, they often don't grapple with those arguments at all. So some simply ignore the question of what East Asian states are doing in the industrial policy sphere at the macroeconomic level. At the microeconomic level, and they just limit themselves to looking at macro changes in these countries. So Kanishka Jayasuriya, for example, limits his evidence for Korea's transformation from a developmental state to a regulatory state to the establishment of an independent central bank. But I think that's problematic because, as I've shown in earlier work, the existence of an independent central bank tells us very little about a state's developmental orientation. Taiwan's central bank, for example, for a long time has played the role of a development financer, a development banker, providing funds to local firms in strategic industries who keep their roots in Taiwan. So some just ignore what's currently happening. Other radical declinists acknowledge those arguments about developmental state evolution, but they reject them. They say, well, sure, the Korean government continues to intervene in the economy to support industry, but there's really nothing particularly developmental about what they're doing. Because basically their industry policy options now are just limited to, we just support national R&D, or we provide incentives to foreign investors, or we assist smaller business. And insofar as all advanced industrial countries engage in those kinds of activities, there's nothing really developmental about them. In fact, those policies are sufficiently universal as to render them unremarkable and indeed compatible with neoliberalism, according to some scholars. What does matter, they argue, is that Korea is no longer supporting its national champions via heavy-handed financial sector control, because that's what developmentalism is all about in Korea. And this brings us back full circle to this problem of having such a narrow, static understanding, policy-centric understanding of what is a developmental state. So clearly then, I think that to really assess the nature of change underway in Korea, we need a more sophisticated and nuanced understanding of what constitutes a developmental state than is offered by radical declinists. And in the book I offer a new conceptualisation of developmental states, drawing on the foundational work of Chalmers Johnson. Some of you, most of you, would be familiar with the work of Chalmers Johnson, so I'm sorry to go over, I won't go over in much detail what Johnson said, but just to shorthand, for Chalmers Johnson, the developmental state was a contrastive concept, and one of his greatest contributions to the development debate wasn't just to identify for the first time the key features of a developmental state, but to specify what sets them apart from other state varieties. So understanding what is a developmental state in contrast to other states. And at the top of his list of distinguishing features were the shared goals or the shared ambitions of the policy elite, those goals being techno-industrial catch-up and competitiveness, as well as shared ideas about how those goals are best met through strategic interventions in the market. So in this way, for Johnson, developmentalism has a clear distinguishing ideational element. It's as much a political economic philosophy as it is a set of institutional arrangements or policy expressions. And in the book, I argue that developmentalism is best understood first and foremost as a mindset, a unifying worldview or set of ideas about the primary purpose of economic activity, which is national security, independence and prestige, about the state's main economic goals, manufacturing capacity, technological autonomy and export competitiveness, and about the most appropriate role for the state in achieving those goals. The state can and should actively intervene in pursuit of those particular objectives. And I also argue that a developmental state implies a particular way of thinking about finance. For developmentally minded policymakers, the purpose of the financial sector is to support the productive economy. Policymakers therefore believe that the state can and should intervene in the financial system to ensure that it serves rather than destabilises the country's manufacturing base, the country's productive capacity. So in highlighting those ideational foundations of developmentalism, I'm not suggesting that the institutional foundations identified by Johnson aren't important, like the pilot agency, the meritocratic bureaucracy, because obviously without an appreciation of those, you can't explain how and why East Asia's developmental states have been so effective in the pursuit of their substantive goals. But the developmental significance of those kinds of institutional arrangements have received really the lion's share of attention in the literature. The ideational foundations of developmentalism have received far less attention, despite arguably, as I mentioned, forming the centrepiece of Johnson's original conceptualisation. And this is hugely problematic in my mind because it's impossible to explain the emergence of institutions associated with developmentalism in the absence of a worldview that privileges techno-industrial catch-up as a political goal and that accepts strategic activism as a natural and necessary role for the state. Without that mindset, you don't get the kind of institutions that exist to enable that goal. And it's also problematic because when you marginalise the ideational foundations of developmentalism or neglect them altogether, as declinists tend to do, is that it implies only one possible response to pressures for change, which is developmental state dismantling. Unless you return ideas to the centre of developmental state theorising, you can't avoid that kind of determinism. You can't anticipate developmental state evolution rather than dismantling. In other words, when you return ideas to the centre, you can anticipate that where there's an enduring will to strategically govern the economy for developmental purposes, policymakers are very likely to look for a way. So that brings me to my third point, the conceptual and analytical frameworks that I developed to explain developmental state emergence and evolution. So, in the book, I offer a mindset-centred conceptualisation of developmental states, one that hinges on a developmental mindset and developmental strategy distinction. I argue that what principally unites developmental states, what makes them developmental, is the presence of a developmental mindset and the capacity to formulate and execute a developmental strategy. So the existence of a mindset and the capacity to formulate and execute a strategy. As I already mentioned, that mindset refers to shared ambitions on the part of the policy elite and shared understandings of how best to realise those ambitions through strategic intervention. Understanding where that mindset comes from is really a sociological task. It has to do with the common formative experience of policy elites in Korea, the experience of policy elites under Japanese colonialism and their exposure to a state-directed model of industrial development. And the presence of that mindset is what leads policy elites in developmental states to devise and execute long-term developmental strategies, the practical means by which policymakers go about pursuing their goals. And so one of my key contentions is that while all developmental states pursue developmental strategies, those strategies will necessarily differ both between states and within them over time, reflecting diverse historical experiences and ever-changing political and economic exigencies. And nationally distinctive and temporally contingent development strategies necessarily implies the existence of varied and variable institutional arrangements and policy practices that are nonetheless directed towards the same end goal. So in the book, I trace the shift in Korea from a growth-first strategy under Pak Chung-hee, Chun Doo-hwan and No Tae-woo to a balanced growth strategy, first articulated under President Roh Moo-hyun in 2003 and then continued under each president from 2003 till now. And that period was punctuated by the fracturing of the developmental consensus in 1993 under Kim Young-sam. And that actually culminated in the abandonment of financial activism in Korea between 1993 and 1997, and Korea's embroilment in the 1997 crisis. After the crisis, President Kim Dae-jung oversaw the return of the state to the centre of the financial system, but a new developmental strategy wasn't formalised until 2003. So what I'm proposing is that a key benefit of this mindset strategies distinction is that it frees us from a fixed institutional or policy-centric conceptualisation. And in doing that, it draws our attention to a much wider set of institutions than is typically considered in the developmental state literature. We get out of the focusing on the pilot agency, on the bureaucracy alone. Institutions that might be actually central to the routine functioning and dynamics of developmental policy making in a particular national context. And in Korea, the institutions that I focus on as integral parts of its developmental state extend above the bureaucracy to the president and downwards to development banks. And without considering both the role of the president and the role of development banks, it's impossible to explain the persistence of a developmental mindset in Korea and the continued pursuit of a developmental strategy and of financial activism. So that brings me to the analytical framework that I advance in the book, which is aimed at illuminating the process of developmental state evolution. The framework is inspired by recent innovations in historical institutionalist theorising, especially the work of Steve Bell. You can blame Steve.
Well, that knocks out a few questions.
So basically, I take an institutionally situated institutionally situated interpretive agents. They're just my developmentally minded policymakers as my analytical starting point. And then to explain the recent revival of financial activism in Korea, I examine the ways in which those policymakers have, since the 60s, navigated the ideational and institutional, political and structural terrains confronting them in pursuit of their developmental ambitions. So I'm not suggesting that the mindset itself is impervious to change, but rather what I'm proposing that if the goal is to understand developmental state evolution, we might begin most fruitfully first by asking, well, what conditions, structural, political, etc., first gave rise to a developmental mindset in Korea and shaped its first developmental strategy? And which institutional arrangements enabled the country's first developmentally minded policymakers to translate their strategy into action? That gives us a picture of Korea's developmental state at the outset. And then, equipped with an understanding of the origins of developmental mindset and the institutional underpinnings of the state's capacity for strategic activism, then we can ask, okay, well, what factors have strengthened or weakened the developmental consensus over time and facilitated or frustrated the pursuit of a developmental strategy? In short, while I take developmentally minded policymakers as my starting point, my approach is to focus on the dialectical interplay between these agents and their institutional and structural and political environments, and that allows me to bring ideas back into developmental state analysis without ejecting institutions. The payoff of that is an account that illuminates the dynamics and direction of developmental state evolution, but it avoids the pitfalls of an institution-centric conceptualization of developmental states. I'm nearly done, I promise. So I think it's useful here to give just a clear statement of my argument regarding the revival of financial activism in South Korea and how and the role of mindset in that revival. So my argument is that originally in the 1960s, there was a really far-reaching consensus among the policy and political elite around this developmental worldview. But that consensus began to fracture in the 1970s and the 1980s. And since that time, a developmental mindset has been an enduring constant among some segments of the policy and political elite, especially the key industry ministries, the Bank of Korea, and some segments of the Ministry of Finance. But the resonance of developmental ideas among the wider elite and the broader population has really waxed and waned, depending on the nation's economic and political circumstances. And I further argue that it's possible to explain the waxing and waning of financial activism from over the 1990s and 2000s in terms of shifts in power from more liberally oriented ministries to more developmentally oriented ministries, but more fundamentally the orientation of the president in Korea, as an imperial kind of presidential system, is a key factor behind those policy and power shifts. So, as I alluded to before, in 1993, when Korea abandoned financial activism, that was really the result of the election of a liberally minded president, Kim Young-sam, who saw the embrace of financial liberalisation and the abandonment of financial activism, which in many ways contributed to Korea's embroilment in the 1997 crisis. But since that crisis, the election of developmentally minded presidents has been a key factor motivating and enabling the revival of financial activism in response to a whole host of new economic, political and structural challenges. These include the rise of China, financialisation, energy insecurity and climate change. So, just looking at time, I wanted to do two things before I finish. Okay, I have time possibly for one. So before going further into the specifics of my argument, which I might leave till question time, I just wanted to really briefly return to the declinist debate that I flagged at the beginning, the more moderate debate that does take ideas seriously. Indeed, the moderate declinist arguments about developmental state decline focus explicitly on challenges to developmental ideas. Moderates reject the idea of a neoliberal makeover of developmental states. They accept the idea that all states intervene in their economies in non-regulatory ways. But moderate declinists argue that industrial governance in Korea is no longer developmental and has become less proactive and less planned and kind of more erratic and stop-start. And they argue that perhaps the most important factor contributing to this shift is the dynamic of capitalism itself. And they say, well, when states approach the technological frontier, when they catch up, and the challenge becomes about promoting frontier industries, frontier technologies, policymakers can't do that. No one's able to predict what's going to happen at the frontier. And the costs of trying to do that, to pick winners at the frontier, just become too high. And that eventually all of these mounting failures undermine support for government intervention. And Joe Wong makes this case in relation to the biotech industry in Korea and Taiwan and Singapore. And he says, well, the Korean and developmental state has been trying to be developmental at the frontier, but in face of mounting failures in biotech in particular, there's no longer public support for a developmental project, and actually the state's now just choosing to walk away from a lot of those projects. So what can we make about of these kinds of arguments? I think that there's very little to dispute in Wong's analysis of the complexities and costs involved in biotech in particular. It's true, Korea has really struggled, along with countless other countries, to meet the challenges of biotech industry building. And Korea's challenges there are really amplified by the fact that it's effectively starting from scratch with almost no pre-existing competencies in basic life science research. And in fact, given the arguably exceptional nature of biotech and the low base from which Korea is starting, it seems fair to ask if biotech isn't really the weakest test case of developmental state decline. The point I make in the book is if you look at areas or efforts to create high-tech industries in areas that Korea has some relevant competencies, you find really different results. But beyond that, that narrow focus on biotech, I think there are other limitations to Wong's argument about the state being, it's all too hard and it's walking away. His argument is really important because it sheds light on the question of the kinds of political conditions that are necessary to sustain developmental activism. And the question I guess he asks is, have policy failures in biotech really been sufficient to undermine popular support for, or at least acceptance of, the state's wider developmental project? In the book, I argue that there's really very little evidence to support the claim that policy failures have manifested in any form of anti-developmentalism in Korea, and quite the contrary. Indeed, since the early 2000s, a host of whole new pressures have fueled the developmental ambition of the policy elite in Korea, and also created a kind of developmental nostalgia among the wider population, creating conditions that have been absolutely ripe for the revival of developmental policy making and the revival of financial activism. These pressures I've mentioned: China's growing competitive challenges, the challenge of financialisation, the onset of jobless growth that accompanied Korea's shift towards high-tech industry promotion, energy insecurity, climate change. And since 2008 in particular, these pressures and the perceptions of insecurity that they've bred have really outweighed concerns about policy failure. No one really cares if the government's failing in Korea right now, but rather it's reinvigorated political and public appetite for developmental activism. And capitalising on that shift, governments since 2008 really have campaigned on a very nationalist platform centred around economic revival. The former President Lee Myung-bak implicitly offering himself as a new kind of Park Chung-hee for the 21st century. And Lee very much oversaw the full flowering of financial activism in Korea as a part of the country's new development strategy. So, I'll conclude by saying that the revival of financial activism in Korea that I trace in the book hasn't been linear, and it hasn't gone uncontested, either locally or internationally. So in developing my argument, I pay close attention to the international and domestic pressures that have compelled successive governments to intervene in financial markets for strategic purposes, and the ideational, institutional, structural and political factors that have at various times facilitated or frustrated their efforts. Overall, I offer a rigorous defence of the developmental state idea and its continuing relevance as both a concept and a reality, be it for scholars interested in the political foundations of techno-industrial transformation, or for policy practitioners grappling with questions of what is possible in a financially integrated world. Thank you.
Fantastic.